There we are. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Briar Harvey. This is the Neurodiversity Media Network, and this is the Voices of Neurodiversity. Today, I'm here with the fabulous Greta, who I met in the Catalyst. I'm sure we will probably talk about the Catalyst. It seems like that's just our unofficial sponsor for the show today. If you would like to join the Catalyst and hang out with me and Greta, you can find that link at briarharvey.com/catalyst, baby. And we are talking about culture, which is already a loaded word. The topic becomes much more loaded. And we have talked about culture a lot on this show, on this network, because culture is something that we are building all of the time. It is something we are in active co-creation with all of the time. And it's something most of us do badly. So there we are. We have to do it all of the time, and we do it badly, which means that there are many opportunities to learn, grow, and improve. And that's what Greta does. So, Greta, introduce yourself. Tell us about you and how you came to this work.
Well, hello, everyone. So, Greta Lax. I am, and because I'm super creative, my company is Greta Lax LLC. So that should be relatively easy to remember. Um, who am I? So, as it says, I'm a coach and consultant and facilitator. But one of my favorite things to do, one of the things that I really love doing, is working with individuals or small teams on what we call intercultural development. And what that really means is helping folks develop an understanding of where you are in terms of, we look at it as a developmental scale, where your mindset is and where your capacity is for navigating cultural differences. And that's culture broadly defined, right? Think of dimensions, various dimensions of culture, dimensions of diversity that are, so much a part of today's conversations. Helping people to see their current way of navigating differences, where some of the strengths are, where the opportunities are, where some of those barriers might come in based on where you are today, and then working with folks to develop, a strategy for helping you meet your goals in that area, and really finding goals that are important to you, that align with your interests. We talk about this a lot, that align with your curiosity, because if you're coming at this just because you gotta do it, that's not going to help
And
help
you're
you
not going
move
to do
forward, right? Yeah, we need that hook, and I think some of the tools that I use in this work really are good at helping folks to identify and walking folks along that plot of figuring out where their curiosity lies and hooking into that and using that to create a development plan that fits along with your mission and vision and goals, for whether it's work, personal, probably both, because it's inseparable. How did I come to this work? So I have always been interested in, and always kind of felt like an outside observer in a lot of ways. So when I was young, my family didn't get to travel very much, but I did get to spend time with family in other parts of the country. So a couple summers. And even then I could tell the distinct differences. Even within our family, relatively close family, distinct differences in how people lived, how people saw the world, how people interacted with the world. And to the point where I was so curious about it that I became a foreign exchange student through the Rotary during my senior year of high school. So I spent a year in Brazil, just shy of a year actually in Brazil. So I've always had this innate curiosity, and I've always been interested in human behavior. So got my undergraduate in psych, not quite sure what I did with it, was going to do with it at the time. But along the way, kind of a windy path, found my way to industrial organizational psychology, which is the science of really understanding people within organizations and coming at that from different lenses, both from the organizational level lens, where you're talking about organizational development, change management, organizational culture, right, organizational level variables, to also the very human side of it, where we're looking at everything from how do we better understand individual roles within the organization, and how do we use that information to better recruit and select and train and retain and performance, like all of those individual level variables as well. So all of this meshed very well together along the way. I've also had a great deal of experience working with through health equity, social determinants of health type issues. Became the center of my work for most of the last decade, actually a little more than a decade. And all of that, those different threads kind of led me to where I am today. Trying to make a path, trying to help people find their own path through this work.
And there are a lot of threads in this work. We've talked at length with Faith Clark. I know you know Faith. And work culture design is the name of that conversation. And it's been really interesting pulling apart the pieces of culture in the workplace specifically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there are so many layers at play there, especially if you happen to have a marginalized identity in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so figuring out how to navigate those systems is a lot of work, and also I think something that if we do it well can bring a lot of joy and a lot of satisfaction and a lot of change on the micro level to these kinds of organizational systems at large. So I have to ask here, because this is what we do here, Greta. Please, for me, define culture.
So right, a culture is generally a shared sense of meaning making in a lot of ways. So some people talk about objects, right? People talk about shared values, shared beliefs. So those are kind of the components that make up culture. And right, that's extremely broad.
By design. Well done.
Yes, by
Well
design.
done.
And it matters, right? Even context matters very much for that conversation, right? So, but in general, it is where is that shared meaning coming from, or lack of it, and how does that impact where you are within whatever context it is you're talking about? So whether you're talking about work, whether you're talking about outside of work, yeah, that's.
So, what does it look like then to examine culture in the workplace, and how do we broadly become interested in this analysis?
So I think it's how we get people interested is understanding the impact that it has, right? So where is that impact, and how is it serving or not serving the organization and the individuals within the organization? So that's really kind of typically the, what prompts the analysis. Something is afoot.
Right. And that's almost universally true of culture design. I have found in these conversations I'm having with so many fabulous educators and consultants, the reality is that you don't get called in until it's broken.
Or something's broken, and
Hmm.
they can't necessarily put their finger on it, identify it. um, and a lot of times it initially shows up as, people are the problem. you know these people are the problem, or we're having a problem with this person, or these people over here, or this group. Where, often being able to take that step back, um, and take a much higher level analysis is really important to being able to understand the much larger dynamics at play and how they then contribute to. Now, certainly that's not always the case, but very often. And it's a really important part, especially as whether you're external or internal consultant, because again, even if you're an internal, a lot of that stuff is unspoken, unsaid, unwritten. Um, and it's important to even then take that step back and do that analysis, because, your idea of what that culture is may not be shared with
Hmm.
everybody else. And it's important to understand um, those similarities and the distinctions between, and the bigger picture of how other people see it, especially the people who are in power, right?
Right. And culture is created en masse. So everyone involved in that culture is playing a part in its co creation, which is much easier to do if you're aware of that, right? It's conscious co-creation
Yeah.
means we have a chance at building something intentional. But when we are not conscious of that.
Right. Then we're not paying attention to both the opportunities that presents, right? Both how that impacts the decisions we make, the policies we put into place, the practices. We're not conscious of the impact on all of those things. Then we're not seeing both how things, where problems may be coming from, the source of how that may be the source of some of the issues, or a contributing factor to those issues. Um, yeah, it's part of our job. It's a huge part of our job, is making the invisible visible for folks, and that's at both the systems level and at the individual level.
So let's talk broadly about how we do this.
Broad, oh, so at the systems level, right? It's again, it's very context specific. Um, you don't have a set. This is, I'm going to come into your organization and this is what I'm going to do, right? And if somebody's selling you a boxed kit that this is what I always do, uh,
Run,
look further,
run.
keep looking. um, eh, However, from my perspective, it is important to come in with questions at the various levels, right? So at the organizational and at the individual level, and systems, policies, all that stuff, teams, or depending on kind of the type of organization you have, but that's typically an issue as well. Not an issue; it's typically um, variable we need to consider. So it's coming in and asking all the questions. Edgar Schein was one of the OGs when it comes to organizational development, and he talked back in the day about a process consultation, which was a really important read for me, and has since written also about humble inquiry. Actually, he passed away this year. But his writings have been really influential for me, just kind of as a, what's the word? Not so much for the detail, but more for the approach to the work. Coming in and asking questions, at all levels, coming in and giving folks a chance to have a voice to the best of your ability so that you're hearing and understanding things from multiple perspectives, and then using that information to inform your approach.
Yeah, but pedagogy isn't like a system in a box, right?
God, no.
It's a method, and certainly there's structure to it,
Mhm.
but it very much allows for diagnosis.
Absolutely. And that's too. So giving that voice early on will kind of help lead you in terms of what are the tools that you need to use for that diagnostic. Um, an organization that you've gone into and talked to, well, clearly here, trust and justice are an issue in this organization. That's the first thing that comes up in my first conversations. You can feel the tension. You could cut it with a knife. All right, here's something that we need to take a look at, because this is something people aren't paying attention to. So that's where I'm going to go initially with that as a diagnostic tool. Right. So kind of what comes out of those early conversations, and yes, organizational culture is a piece of that. And it just kind of depends on which slice you need to look at and where you need to start, because obviously you can't overwhelm everybody with all of the studies, you need to prioritize.
Because
And at
again,
the individual level, and that's looking at the organizational level.
right.
And then kind of depending on the priority, if you have the opportunity to work at this on an individual level, which is much of the work that I really enjoy doing, is trying to figure out where individuals are on their path, so that they can better understand, where they are, where they stand, where their mindset is, and then trying to help them better understand their role in this work, because we all have roles in this work. If we're going to be honest about it, we all have a part to play. And trying to understand, quite often you start with leadership, because that's, where the levers of power exist. Or it may be one particular branch of the organization that you're being asked to focus on, and look at that there. So there are tools on both ends of it. But again, so much of it is just dependent upon the conversations that you have when you walk into that organization. So in that organization where trust was a really significant issue, I'm not gonna jump on the individual level first. I'm gonna go in the direction that's going to help me hold up that mirror best for them, show them the things that they're not seeing about what's happening within the culture, the systems, the processes, and people's reactions to them, and how that is feeding into, whatever it is that's observable to them, what they're seeing, typically the problems that they're seeing. Yes, it's great to come in and we can do this work proactively, but that's not the norm. It's a lovely pipe dream.
It is a lovely pipe dream. And we will talk at the end here how an individual does this work and does some further exploration. But I want to know, so we're coming into an institution that is broken in some way.
Mhm.
And it is largely because there is something broken in the culture itself,
Mhm.
and we require the culture at large to make some kind of change. How do we do that?
So that's a it's a really great point to discuss now, because I think much of that is missing right now in the, or has been missing in a lot of these conversations, particularly because DEI is diversity, equity, inclusion is a huge focus of the work that I do, um, and there's not been enough attention paid to the fact that much of this work is change management work,
Mm-hmm.
is organizational development and change management work. Um, so it is really being aware. How do you change a culture? So obviously the first step is awareness, but then there's all of these other components of it that you have to have a clear handle on and have to have a clear plan for moving forward. So once you've been able to hold up that mirror for folks, actually, you want to start this work before you hold up the mirror and fold up those results, but really truly understanding where people are coming from. So what is the mission, vision, values of the organization? What are the goals of the organization? What are they achieving? What are they not achieving? And then how does this fit in, right? Whatever the diagnostic tools you're using. Then you have a context for that, how, and for talking to people about how this may be impacting what they're trying to accomplish, getting in the way of them accomplishing their mission, their vision, their goals. And you have to have a clear understanding of the entire system, really, because how you even roll out that conversation about those results is really critical. This is to me, this is where so much of what Shine talked about was important, um, even if it wasn't it wasn't a cookbook. His work didn't say go in and do this, this, and this. It was more of a be sure you have a larger understanding and that you go in um, listening more than talking, which is another thing to be conscientious of when you bring somebody into the organization. If they're spending a lot of their time upfront telling you things as opposed to listening, that's a huge red flag. Because I don't know you yet. I don't know your organization yet. And I really need time to get up to speed on some of those things. And with that information, understanding the people, understanding the processes that kind of exist, the structures that exist within the organization, communication, the way things are communicated through an organization, it's coming up with a strategy to work through those existing structures, to work through those existing pipelines um, for information, um, understanding the power structure, the power structures within the organization, and kind of using that to map out, right, how you're going to take this information and use it to move forward. So then you're taking all those bits of information about the mission, vision, goals. You're taking the information about what you know about the structure, the people, the processes, and kind of melding those together into a very customized plan for moving that forward within that organization.
When we do accessibility work, one of the things that we're really seeing is that this is very operational in nature. What I need and don't have are concrete things like an org chart, like an actual wiki, company wiki, like this is what happens. This is what we do here. I need onboarding that actually tells me what my job is, how I do it, who I report to. And it feels like these things should be foundational, but are so frequently overlooked.
So, as somebody who comes through an IO psychology lens, that's absolutely preaching to the choir because that is the basis of our work. And then when you look at what companies are actually using this information, using what we've learned through research and through evidence-based practice in the field of industrial organization, that's the important, that is a huge piece of it, is nailing down those bits and pieces. So from being extremely conscientious about understanding the roles, each of the individual roles, and using that information, right? So having very clear job descriptions, having very clear understanding, those are tools from which the rest of the processes should be built. And that's not what happens. People kind of go on a website and they pull a job description and they slap it into a piece of paper, and too often that's what's happening. So that's a mess for anybody who's trying to recruit, trying to hire, trying to train. That's a mess for the person who's coming into the position. And all of those other tools that you talked about, so that individual level for those individual roles, that's true across much of the organization. It gets a little, obviously that's more tricky as you move up in the organization because those
Right.
roles don't have the same
But
infrastructure.
simple
But
documentation
yes,
would solve so many systemic organizational problems.
and quite often that's done and not maintained, even when it is done.
Right. Even if
Right,
it's done, we don't review. It's done
because
once and we've done it.
right. And whose job is that? Whose job does that become? Because that job was probably cut at some point to maintain that information, because that's so important for moving forward. Like, yes, maybe you just brought in a consultant for the first time to do this work, but that's highly unlikely. You probably had people working on this, whether internally or externally in the past. And having that history of change is really important too, because when we're asking people to change, it's really important to understand historically, what have we already asked these people to do, right? How many times do people just not take any of this seriously because they've been down this road so many times before? So your most experienced, most seasoned people are also likely going to be the most skeptical because they've been down this road so many times before. So it's important to understand that history of change as well. And your idea of like having that documentation available, having that history, that institutional knowledge, and being able to keep it updated and pass that along to people is also really critical for doing this well. In the future, because you have to understand how that plays into people's, the organizations and the individuals within the organization, their attitude coming up to, whatever this next change you're asking them to implement.
I am struck by, if we think of an organization, a business as a culture, the fact that most historically successful cultures value the role of the story keeper, right?
Yes.
There is actually somebody institutionally, culturally, telling our stories, reminding us of where we've been and where we've come from. And that position does not exist in business institutions in a way that I've ever seen clearly defined.
It's because everything is so focused on short-term gains, everything is so focused on the next quarter's results, everything is so right.
Mhm.
So often we lose that long-term perspective, people don't attend to, everything from, you know, general turnover to intentional succession planning. Like, how much are we losing when we lose people for whatever reasons we're losing them? How much institutional history are we losing? And like you said, if there's not somebody who's in that role, is to help keep that. And there are some, organizations that have really good structures for maintaining information. But
story is culture. It's
yeah,
not just
it's not just the
it's
the the
not just the
documents,
dry
the file
documentation and
storage.
information. No. And I can't help but think how, and I've said this before and I will continue to say this, the mistake that capitalism made was prioritizing the stockholder above the shareholder.
Mhm.
And if we had prioritized shareholders as the people who make this thing operate and
Mhm.
work,
Yeah.
if their value was actually structurally designed into the corporate structure, it would be a whole different world.
We've got a whole different level of engagement
Right.
when that's right. You've got a whole different level of engagement, and there's, gobs of research talking about how important that is to your success as an organization. And yeah, if all of your attention is going to these external folks that hold the paper, as opposed to the folks who actually make your company work, no matter what size your company, you've taken away an enormous piece of motivation for folks, an enormous reason for folks to connect to and feel part of that organization and that organizational culture. That becomes part of your organizational culture. That's what you're telling your folks through that organizational culture, is that they don't matter as much as those external folks.
Yeah, and I think that we get to build deliberately when we
Mhm.
are starting over. But that's not often where you come in, is it, Greta?
No, 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 no. We because that requires folks to be proactive, and there certainly are companies who are proactive, but they're not the norm. So right, so we get called in because there's a problem, and then when there's not a quick fix, people also get easily distracted. When you're coming in and saying that you need to shift culture, when you're coming in and saying we need to identify where the systemic problems are and change the systems, the practices, the policy, that this is long-term work. and and
It's
and that
definitely
is
not a quick fix.
also part of the job of the consultant, is to identify where the immediate needs are, right? Because it's human nature. We need to see some quick wins somewhere. So it's important for us to be able to, as we're telling this story, as we're listening and absorbing the story from them, to figure out where some of those opportunities are to bring in some quick wins, and maybe to me that's cosmetic. But if that's something that's important to the organization and is going to help me get ongoing buy-in to do the work that we really need to do to move towards some of those longer term goals, then that's what we have to do. I can, I can have all the feelings that I want to have about what this work needs to be. That's what matters, is how I can align what I know, the knowledge that I have, with the existing needs of the organization, and how we can weave those together to achieve the goals that are important to that organization and help them get there.
So they're quick, cheap wins, but give us a good example of what that might look like.
I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. A quick cheap win. So it might be a process, right? So maybe you've just got a process that's wonky and you can clearly see where the problem is coming in because you don't have clear role definition here, so it might just be addressing a role definition issue. Like, yes, here's where you're running into this because this department thinks this is where things are supposed to go. This department thinks this. Here is a way that we can change, whether it's the process, change the role, change the whatever's the easiest way to do it in that moment to address it. That's also not going to get in the way of longer term gains, right? Finding that piece, because suddenly then you've got a little bit more credibility. Also, you're building credibility as an outside voice, and you're like, okay, you help me fix this. Now maybe I'm going to listen to some of the other things you got to say that are a little bit harder to listen to. I'm going to take a little bit longer to work through.
Let's go in the complete opposite direction. How do I help identify, if I'm in the organization, that there are problems so that the company chooses to hire someone like you?
Gosh, I was just having this conversation. Kind of in the process of having this conversation with a group that brought me in because they heard me on a podcast and they're like, there's stuff. we've got issues. Here's a transition that's happening. Here are some of the questions that we have. This isn't going particularly well. We're feeling some struggles here, but the C-suite isn't listening. They're not seeing it. They don't see it's like, okay, so then let's have a further conversation. Let's talk about talk to me about the 3 or 4 things that you see right now as issues. And then let's talk about which one of those issues has an immediate impact on the bottom line, can have an immediate impact on the bottom line, so that you can frame this conversation in a way that those folks in the decision-making positions are more likely to hear you the first time. So they don't hear you as just whining about interpersonal issues, right? All the ways that this can get interpreted. Really trying to help them frame what can be very painful, often very painful circumstances that they're dealing with and not being heard. So then you get into that, it's hard not to slip from it's hard not to slip into that child voice sometimes too, especially when this is something that you've been dealing with for a long time. So how can we help people reframe that conversation in a way that's more likely to be heard by the folks that are focused on certain outcomes? So that's the frame we need to use. What are the outcomes they care about, they're worried about right now, so that we can at least start the conversation about how this is impacting the organization in ways that matter.
That's correct. It's always about the outcomes. And for most of the decision makers at large in the C-suite, that outcome is dollar signs. So how can you shape the problems in a way that makes it clear that we are losing money by not solving this problem?
And that's where these conversations come in, right? That's the importance of having these conversations at the different levels is even more important, because the more you hear of the story, because the initial complaint, what that person sees may not be the real problem, right? That might just be a symptom. And quite often it's just a symptom of the larger issue. So that investigation is, as much as you're able to, whatever you can use to get in the door, is can be a starting point for that larger investigation. So you can have those additional conversations to figure out where the source is, not these downstream issues, which is quite often what we're called in to deal with, is the downstream issues, as opposed to, we need to continue working back to figure out where that's truly coming from.
So once we've established kind of what is causing the problem, we can then take that to leadership and ask for, what do we ask for here, Greta? What are we trying to achieve?
Well, again, that's entirely based upon what they've indicated
Right.
are the mission of the organization, the vision, the values, and their goals. That entire conversation has to be framed around that. And you also have to have an understanding of how committed they are to these various goals. Because goals on paper and what people are actually doing can be very different. So you have to understand where the behavior, like where are they actually focusing, because they might tell you these are the goals, but this is actually where all the budget is, or this is actually where all the person power is being placed. This is all, like, so you have to also attend to those nuances, not just what they're verbally telling you. You have to pay attention to where the investment is going, and then kind of figure out why. um, if there's a misalignment, why is there a misalignment, where is that coming from, and work from there.
Yeah, and this is not easy or easy to sell,
No,
unfortunately.
it isn't. And once you know how to speak the language, right? Because every organization, that's part of the culture. Language is part of the culture. Once you know how to speak their language and understand their values, that you can have an entirely different conversation. And if you are able to have that conversation in a way that focuses on what's meaningful and valuable and important to them, you're having, how could they not pay attention? Yes, sometimes they're still going to choose to keep their eyes closed or let it go, because it's like, that's too much of investment, there's too much whatever, which brings another conversation about, well, can we pull some threads here? Are there a couple of places where you might be willing to start that might be more reasonable based on your current context, economic environment, whatever factors are getting in the way of them wanting to deal with the big picture problems? All right, so where could we start? And is that a meaningful enough place that then I'm still willing and able to feel like my role here can be valuable in helping move the organization forward?
And in organizational terms, I think that's what it comes down to, right? That I am still valued as a part of the culture. As long as that exists, I'm willing to do the work. But as soon as that goes away, I'm gone.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, if your tie to the organization is entirely based on your paycheck,
I don't have any investment to make a change or to do the work.
no, and we know full well that completely impacts people's willingness to, that's a whole other conversation about having a talk about whether people are willing to put in more than the 40-hour week and that kind of thing. I don't want to push anybody in that direction.
No, and I
But
don't
what I
think
do want is people to be in a place where they feel a part of the organization, where they're not feeling othered, where they're feeling a part of something larger. And it so happens then that when that happens, people are more likely to, right, be more invested in what they bring. They're to, maybe some folks are still going to do the bare minimum, but when I'm doing the bare minimum, that can look very different depending on how I feel about what I'm doing.
well, and I think a part of this too comes back to the idea that investment isn't about time, it's about commitment. And so we need to, I think, structurally get away from counting commitment as the
Hours.
hours on the clock, and more, what are we creating and producing for the culture at large? How am I contributing?
Right. And that, I mean, that impacts everything from how your team works together, you know, whether teams are sharing information with one another, whether, like individuals in different roles are sharing information with one another, the extent to which they're willing to do that, whether people feel safe and secure bringing up problems that they see and have identified that exist, bringing up new ideas. It impacts productivity, it impacts innovation, it impacts teamwork, like all of these, right? All of those really critical things that impact your success as a business. And that really requires you to attend to and care about the individuals within your organization. Because if you choose not to, if you're like, well, it's a paycheck, they're here or they're not, I'll fill them with another, that's all well and good. Maybe that works for you, but chances are you are not getting out of your employees, right, the level of that increased level of bringing all of themselves, bringing all of their gifts to that work.
And I think there's a place where that can actually be the goal, that it's not about the number of hours I've committed to this job. It's that I have committed to bring my whole self and to measurably move things forward. So let's talk about the individual. How do we cultivate these skills on an individual level?
So a lot of the, framing this in terms of the work that I do with folks, whether that's on a one-to-one basis or kind of on a group basis, it is, first of all, again, the diagnosis, figuring out where people are on the variable, and whatever it is that you're choosing to focus on. Like I said, quite often the work that I do is around intercultural development, but that may be a little different depending on the team, depending on the group, depending on the individual. But when we talk about creating an environment, in a lot of ways, we're really talking about psychological safety here, right? We're creating an environment of psychological safety that allows folks to be in a position to both feel safe contributing, feel safe learning, right? Because learning requires making mistakes along the way. You have to feel comfortable doing that, feeling safe, contributing new things, new ideas, and also feeling safe, kind of, what do I want to say here? Challenging existing norms, challenging the way things are done, challenging, right? That's kind of, depending on which lens of psychological safety you're looking at, that can be like the highest level, right? So how do we create an environment so that each of us are helping to build that within our organization, our team, right? It looks different if I'm working with a leader, but still each individual contributor has the capacity to build some of those skills. So what do those skills look like, right? Some of that is, first of all, understanding the lens that you're coming in to this with. What is your lens for looking at the work that you're doing, for looking at other individuals within the team that you're doing? How does that impact how you see other people, how you interact with other people, how you value other people, and how you communicate with other people? So understanding that and being willing to do some of that work really requires a lot of, it really does. It requires that curiosity, that willingness to learn, that openness to learn. It requires some humility, because otherwise on average, most people tend to assume other people see the world the same way we do. And we don't. We all have,
We do not.
right? We do not see the world. We each have very different lived experiences that impact the way that we see and interact with the world around us. And we have to be willing to see that and try to learn how to understand the variety of lenses so that we can better and more effectively and more confidently navigate those differences that exist between us, so that we can help ensure that everyone, no matter where they're coming from, um, feels that they have a place at the table and that they're welcome at that table. Um, and then there's, some of the basic, communication skills, those kinds of things. Like, what does this look like? So basic conflict management, right? Because not all conflict is bad. Even though a lot of us are taught, many of us are taught that conflict is bad. Conflict can be productive depending on how it's managed. So it's kind of, getting in, and whether it's an individual or a team, trying to figure out again where the specific issues lie, and then what do we need to work on in order to help that person, again, framing this within their goals. What are their individual, personal, professional goals? And this is where I am, this is where I want to be, and working out that, personalized blueprint to help them move forward as an individual or as a team within that. So it's not all that different. I mean, it is, but it's not.
It is, but it's not. So, for the individual, do you have some specific recommendations, places that they can start to build these frameworks into their life?
So one of the we can talk about the intercultural development inventory, but there are some things that people can do without access to that tool. One of the really most important things that we can do as individuals is truly get a better understanding of ourselves and our own lens on the world. And we don't need a tool to tell us how to do that. We can spend some time looking at journaling, doing this through conversation with others, finding a way to get a better understanding of what it was that framed our lens on the world, right? So where did we grow up? What was the, geographic, was it rural, was it urban? Who were the people around me when I was growing up? What are the institutions, the social institutions that impacted me as I was growing up? What's the schools that I went to? Were there social organizations, religious organizations? What are all of the factors that contributed to developing my lens on the world to what it is today along the way? Once we begin to better understand how our lens was developed, that also helps us to see how others' lenses differ from ours, right? And can be very significantly different, even if we look the same. So getting past that assumption too. So having that basic understanding of ourselves opens us up to that next stage of starting to understand how other people see and experience the world differently, and how, right? Because they had different environment that they grew up, different systems that helped to create their lens. And developing a general understanding about what culture is, right? So we talk about a culture general versus culture specific frameworks. Most people have seen the iceberg, right? Most people have seen the culture iceberg that talks about the things that are very visible, and then the things that lie underneath, and many more things that aren't visible, so we don't necessarily consider them immediately. The things that are visible, like, how people dress, how people speak, and all of those things that we don't know that lie underneath. So developing kind of an understanding of culture that way. And then you might move to learning some more culture specific stuff once you better understand the cultures that are impacting the people and the environment that you spend the most of your time. So if you're coming across a lot of folks from a specific culture, doing some work, doing some legwork to better understand the culture that they come from. And then we want to navigate, right? Because we don't want to assume everybody from a culture thinks the same way, but it can at least
We are not a monolith.
inform.
Yes.
Yes, but that can at least better inform our questions, our conversations, the thoughts that we have about how we're choosing to interact with people in the workplace.
And I think that we get to sit with this discomfort, right? That
Whole other
there's
skill that also needs to be added in there. Yes.
right. I think a big part of as I move forward with my own exploration, it's the points of friction. Where does this feel hard? And why is that so? And what can I learn to make it feel less hard?
I love that so much. I'm so glad you brought that up. Um, because quite often, right, that discomfort, that's our learning zone, right? That's our zone of proximal development. That's where we don't want to go too far, because if it's shutting us down, we've gone too far. We've gone outside of that zone. But if it's making us a little bit uncomfortable, like, okay, learning to understand that as information, to understand that feeling is information. And I've had to do this as well, right? I learned to recognize when I get that feeling in the pit of my stomach, whether it's an interaction, whether it's something I'm reading, whether it's when I get that feeling, noticing it, right? Being non-judgmental about it. Okay. All right. I'm sensing something here. What is this? Giving ourselves some time and space to investigate where that's coming from. If you're like me, I'm a little bit of a slow processor. So I often, when that happens, need to walk away and come back to it. Like, okay, let me step away, because I had to, so now if it was a big one, now my nervous system's involved. So I need to go, have a cup of tea and come back to this. You can't always do that in an interpersonal interaction, but when you can, understanding what your triggers are and how you need to manage them. And then coming back to it and really investigating where that feeling is coming from is a really important skill to have. Whereas too many of us, the minute we get uncomfortable, shut down. The minute we feel that discomfort, shut down, where it's a perfect learning opportunity right there is to take the time to figure out where that is coming from and why, because quite often that is an external voice, an
Mhm.
external alarm bell, that's something that we were taught along the way. And that gives us a moment to consider that voice, to consider where that's coming from, and think about whether that's truly serving us.
We don't like sitting with the discomfort, Greta.
Oh, of
We
course
do
not.
not. That's hard, and that's a skill that requires practice.
Absolutely.
So, I would like for you to give us some of your best tips for doing just that thing.
For sitting with the
For
discomfort.
sitting with the discomfort because of all of the things that come to cultural and intercultural development.
Mhm.
This is it, right? If I can't sit with my discomfort, I am never going to grow. I'm never going to be able to make any demonstrable changes that
Yeah.
will allow me to not do this thing again.
And I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important when we're working with folks on this to, when we're working on growth in this area, to be working in areas that people already have an interest in and a curiosity in, because that will help keep people going. So, ideally, when you have the choice and you're working with folks, it's picking that area that they already have that interest in, and using that as a little bit of a carrot, right? Um, it is also teaching people a lot of this is emotion regulation, right? um, so a lot of it is learning how to feel a feeling and observe it for at the same time, right? And maybe not at the same time. It might take you a little bit of time to develop that skill. So developing a practice, helping people developing a practice of in actually at the beginning, quite often it's not going to happen in the moment. It might happen later. So quite often it's, oh, you know what happened earlier today? I felt really, maybe you're not going to say dysregulated. I got really mad, or I felt really shitty, or I had that feeling and it just didn't feel good. So reflect using that act and practice of reflection to look back and see what was really happening within that situation. So developing that practice. Again, however you do that, if journaling is comfortable for you, I know everybody likes to say journaling, but not everybody likes journaling. So I'm not going to say so for some people that's journaling, for some people it's having a conversation with somebody who's close to you. And ideally somebody who's also going to be honest with you. Who's willing to talk through that, or even just listen, because sometimes just the act of being able to talk about it, right? So maybe you don't even want that person talking. You say, hey, I just want you to listen while I talk this out for myself. Whatever it is to get that out so that you have a chance to process that outside of your brain. And then using that again to come back to figuring out what it was that set that off. What is it? Where did that discomfort come from? Is that something that you feel like, is it because of a belief that you have? Is it because of a bias that you have? Is it, right? Where is that coming from? And being willing and able, practicing being very honest with yourself about investigating the source of that feeling. Like, even if I don't say I'm reading an article and I get really upset about it, even if I don't agree with what the author is saying, I can practice being dispassionate about reading it so that I can okay, I got really mad about this part. It's this part here that really set me off. They said this, and that made me really angry. Or they said this, and it made me really uncomfortable. Being able to kind of the practice of tearing those pieces out and examining it, and then figuring out, okay, now I'm going to sit back and try and figure out why this made me uncomfortable. Is it something that goes against my beliefs, against my values, or does it just go against a voice in my head that came from somebody else somewhere down the line, which is easier to do once you've examined where many of those voices are coming from, which is why we talk about the self-reflection piece first. So that's a big part of it, right? Is developing this critical self-reflection practice. And that's exactly what it is. Doesn't matter how long I do this work, I still have to practice.
We call it a practice because we got to keep doing it over and over and over again. There is no point in time where I could ever say that anyone is a cultural master. It doesn't happen.
No, and culture isn't stagnant. There's always other dimensions, there's always other aspects, and there's always change. So there's always something to work with. But understanding and working on your own emotion regulation is a part of it too, and that's very individual because because we all have different makeups when it comes to that, and understanding our own systems and our own ways of managing and dealing, which, can be a whole nother barrier. That's a really interesting conversation to have here in Neurodiversity Media Network too, because that can be an additional barrier for some folks, is that emotion regulation piece of it, right? So understanding that, and if this is still something that's really important to you, getting the support that you need, the resources you need to work through that, no matter where you're coming from, because sometimes you just can't work this out yourself. Sometimes there's a sticking point and you need a coach, a therapist, a friend, somebody to talk through some of these things with and figure out where that's coming from, so that you can better decide, right? Because that's what it comes down to, is learning how to be intentional about what you do with this.
And I don't think we could leave it any better place than that. Culture is about intention. And if you don't bring intentionality to it, then you're just going to be, as my friend Grace likes to say, flanging it around and doing whatever you want to do with it. All right. Specifically, where can people find you, and what does the work look like if they wish to go deeper with you?
Yeah. So I'm mostly on LinkedIn. I do have a presence on IG and Facebook. But mostly on LinkedIn. My website, GretaLaxLLC.com, and just about everywhere I've got a little link, so that you can either message me if that's what you're most comfortable doing, or set up a call, free 30-minute call, because it's pretty hard to do this over an email. Yes, I can. And my email's out there. But let's set up a conversation, because a lot of times people really aren't sure where to start. They aren't sure what they need, and whether that's individual coaching, whether that's something that you want and need to do as a group, whether it's a consult that you need to dig a little bit further into things. I love having those conversations with folks and helping them better identify at least a starting point, an entry point, and what might be the best place for them to come into this work.
All right, my friend. We will have all of the links in the show notes. Thank you all so much for being here today. Greta, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. This has been absolutely delightful. And I hope that people are more deliberate about creating culture in the future.
Thanks so much, Briar.
All right, y'all. We will see you again next time. Have an amazing day. If you have not yet subscribed to the Neurodiversity Media Network, you can do that at neurodiversitymedianetwork.com. You'll get access to all of our back catalogs where all of these wonderful conversations live, and all of our master classes, which have additional resources and a bunch of things that you can learn and grow with. And we would love to see you there. Have an amazing day.